I think that this series often gets lost in the discourse of how difficult it is or is not to read. And I think that that's a travesty, and I'm here to share my experience reading this book twice in over 10 years. Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori. I am very excited to make this video, and it's been a long time coming, if I'm being honest. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Gardens of the Moon by Steven Erikson. This is book 1 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and the approach that I want to take to this video today is I want to talk a little bit about the difference in my experience when I first read it to rereading it now 10 years later. So I have not made it a secret on this channel that Malazan Book of the Fallen has been one of my favorite series of all time. It's been incredibly influential to me as a writer, and I can say that having only read 4 of the 10 books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. I read Gardens of the Moon for the first time when I was back in college, and it's actually over 10 years now. It would have been probably close to 11 or 12 years. I was very new to epic fantasy. I had not read much in terms of anything that was in the adult fantasy genre. I started with Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. I had read that trilogy, and I'd also read a trilogy called Hammer of God by Karen Miller. I picked up Gardens of the Moon based on the recommendation of a close friend of mine who was much more well-versed in epic fantasy than I was, and he handed me a copy of the mass market paperback of Gardens of the Moon and said, you know, I think you should try this. It's really, really good. Now, the friend that recommended this book to me was quite a bit more, in my opinion, advanced in terms of just literary comprehension than I was at that point. One of my main reasons for making this video is because I think that Malazan Book of the Fallen often gets talked about in the fantasy community as being an advanced series, or like it's better on the reread. You hear people say, oh, get your notebook out, like you're really gonna have to stretch your brain to understand what's going on in this series. There's so many videos talking about how to read this series. If you look at people's most intimidating series that they've wanted to get to but haven't yet, or that they're like putting off, usually Malazan is on one of those lists. 12 years ago when I first read this book, I was brand new to epic fantasy. I really didn't understand what was going on in terms of the larger story scope when I read this book. And what I did love about it was the characters. Erikson does a phenomenal job of taking something that's incredibly vast in scope, like the world of Malazan, and bringing it down into character moments that are very intimate and very engaging. And that's where I think the power of this series really ends up shining. The fact that I really didn't know much about what was going on, and yet still read through this entire book and moved on to book number 2 because I loved the characters and I wanted more, I think is really a testament to how well this book can reach someone who isn't used to this style of writing. I also want to say that my particular reading style doesn't always mesh well with books where I have to keep track of a ton of details and I have to really figure out the bigger picture. One of the side effects of my ADHD is the fact that sequential processing is very difficult for me. So being able to go back to a book and say this, then this, then this, then this, and that leads to, is really difficult. So for me, I tend to read for the emotional experience first. Now that doesn't mean that I'm going to forget the plot or I can't figure anything out, but it definitely makes it more difficult for me to read series where you have to put a lot of pieces together. And usually what happens is I read those series and I look for the characters that are really going to connect with me and resonate with me, and they are the reason that I continue on in the story. And then I may have other people who I know that have read it explain to me what I missed, and that's just a whole different other level of enjoyment, because then I can be like, oh wow, so those two things were connected and that sort of thing. That's just personally how I read and some of the process that I go through when I'm reading series like this. So the characters in book one pulled me in enough to really care, and Erikson did such a great job of giving me really meaningful fragments, the dialogue, the character interactions. There's obviously so much going on in terms of the history of the world, the magic system, the pantheon that's involved with the mortal plane. All of these things work together to create this story. But for me, what it has always come down to is how I felt about the characters. For this series specifically, book number 2, which is Dead House Gates, is really where Malazan sunk its claws into me very heavily, and that book remains my favorite fantasy book of all time. It's been hugely influential to me as a writer and as a reader. It has just stayed very firmly lodged in my heart, and I haven't stopped thinking about it for over a decade. And to me, that is what powerful storytelling really looks like. So moving forward in time, 12 years later to 2023, I have been saying that I was going to reread this series forever. I was afraid of not having that experience again with this series, and I think that was a fear. I was afraid to jump back in and to have a slightly different experience, right? Because it's not ever going to be the same type of experience that it was the first time. We can't recreate that, and that's one of the sorrows that I think we all have as readers is imagine going back and being able to experience your favorite series or your favorite book for the first time again, and how beautiful that would be. In July 2023, I picked up Gardens of the Moon again and I reread it. I was not disappointed. Now, first of all, I know a lot of people say, oh, this is better on a reread, and you get so much more out of it the second time around. And I want to address that a little bit. Overall, I had forgotten so much of what happened in this book that it really was like reading it in part again for the first time. The one major difference that I saw in my experience with this book versus the first time that I actually think contributed more to my enjoyment of it the second time around. I'm coming into this series this time with a much deeper foundation in fantasy storytelling and a wide variety of styles, of subgenres, of authors, of series lengths, of formats. Like, I've read so much more fantasy now. It didn't feel confusing the way that it did the first time. And it wasn't necessarily because I remembered everything. It was more because I think I was able to follow the story better because I had that foundation in fantasy. I think that the discourse around this series is just so heavily focused on whether or not it is impossible to read or intimidating to read. That's so much of what people talk about in this series, and that makes me sad because I feel like, honestly, if I can read this series and fall in love with the characters and follow it to the degree that I do, honestly, any fantasy reader can. And I want to reiterate that I think one of the beautiful parts about this series is really how Erikson manages to keep the focus so incredibly intimate and character-driven despite the vastness of this story and the history and the multiple continents and this very intricate pantheon and magic system that's all interwoven, and that's, to me, where the magic is. And I would like to go on record and say that I don't think that this series deserves the level of intimidation expectation that people give it. Is it going to be difficult for somebody like I was in college who really didn't have any background in reading epic fantasy? Is it going to be difficult for somebody like that to jump into? Possibly, yes. But again, I think it depends on what other things you've read. Whether it's an advanced fantasy series or not, I really feel like depends on the individual reader. It really does. There are some people that I would recommend, maybe reading some other things first. There are other people that I would immediately recommend this to and say, yeah, absolutely, I think you can handle this, no problem. For me, especially, coming into this series, I didn't have a notebook. I didn't try to figure everything out. I put some tabs in for, honestly, these are just showcasing some of my favorite moments in the book. I'm just trying to be with the characters in the moment they're in and take everything at just as it comes and not try to figure everything out, because I can see where that would be very intimidating in this story. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of pieces that are connected. There's not a lot of, as they say, hand-holding in this series, and that's all true. But for me, this series is my favorite series because of the incredible world that is created and given to us through the perspective of some very intimate, flawed, and diverse character perspectives, and that's what makes it magic. I really love this series, and reading Gardens of the Moon for the second time just incredibly increased my enjoyment of it, but not just because I was reading it for the second time and not because I knew what was going to happen or I'd read books ahead. Like, obviously I'm picking up on some things here and there, characters that are mentioned that I know more about having read up to book 4, but I don't really feel like that explains my increased enjoyment of this second go-round. I do really think that having read a lot more fantasy has contributed to that. And there's also the nostalgia of going back and rediscovering a lot of these characters in as much of a first time as I can achieve now, having already read the book so long ago. I'm just so excited to jump back into this series and to have a new first-time experience with Dead House Gates 10 years later, and see what I remember and how my experience since I read it the first time changes my opinion of the characters and what I relate to, because that's another thing. I relate to different characters in different ways now because I've had 10 plus years of experience as a human being that are now being added to this series. This is a series that I think is just incredibly special, and I'm really excited to continue sharing my experience with it with you guys. If you feel intimidated by Malazan Book of the Fallen and you haven't really given it a shot yet because you've heard everybody say that you're gonna need your professor hat on, you're gonna need a PhD, you're gonna need a notebook, you're not gonna have a clue what's happening, I would encourage you to just let the book speak for itself. That's my advice. I think there's no right way to read this series. I don't think that it's going to be the same experience for everyone, and I honestly think that the magic of this series is very much found outside of all of the incredible amounts of discourse surrounding it. Let yourself have your own experience with it and then jump into the conversation and see what resonates with you. That's my very rambly, disorganized PSA and experience rereading Gardens of the Moon after 10 years. I would absolutely love to hear thoughts in the comments from those of you that have read the series or are rereading the series. Did you have a different experience the second time around? How did you approach reading the series? I would also love to know down in the comments which of the 10 books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen are your favorite. And yeah, I look forward to sharing this journey with you guys and talking more about this series on my channel, and I'm very grateful that I finally broke past the procrastination and actually read this book. Massive shout out to my buddy read partners, Ty the Reader Guy and Nuclear Katie, who have been reading this along with me. We're going to be moving into Dead House Gates soon. Also, if you're still here, definitely check out my conversation where I was able to have Steven Erikson on my channel earlier this year and talk to him for the first time. That was a bucket list experience, and I am so grateful that I was able to have it, and I very much look forward to having more conversations with him about writing in the future. I also was able to have him as a guest on my show Imposter Syndrome, where myself and Steven Erikson and my friend Andrew D. Meredith, who is also a fantasy author, all talked about world building, and that was such an incredibly eye-opening, and just I felt like I just sat there with a notebook most of the time, actually. Definitely check both of those out. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this content, like and subscribe. Check out my Patreon details down below. And yeah, happy reading, you guys. I hope you are reading 5-star reads, having a great week, and I will see you in the next video.